read rather a lot of books in January, so I'm only going to talk about each one briefly, but do let me know if you'd like me to talk more about any of them, and I might do a 3 review video or something like that. I'm still not quite sure how I managed to read this much this month, because I have been working full time, but on the few days off that I've had, I've been reading quite a bit. So, without further ado, the first book I finished was Bobcat and Other Stories, a collection by Rebecca Lee. I was very impressed by this collection. Most of the stories are set at universities, and a lot of them have the theme of unrequited love. As with any short story collection, some were stronger than others. I think my favourite one was Min. This is definitely one that I'd recommend. Then I read Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This is certainly a book that lived up to my expectations of it. I thoroughly enjoyed it, gave it 5 stars. I think most people know the general outline of this by now, so it's good. Believe the hype. Then I read a book that I got for Christmas. It's The Bookshop Book by Jen Campbell. This is just charming and wonderful. If you love books, and I assume if you're watching this you love books and therefore love bookshops, then this is a fantastic read. And then I finished listening to The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. This book wasn't quite as thrilling as Jane Eyre, but I do think that it can stand proudly next to Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. Then I listened to I Feel Bad About My Neck by Nora Ephron. I wasn't overly impressed by this. Thought that the stuff that she was talking about was pretty trivial. The things that annoyed me in Lena Dunham's recent set of essays were amplified in this collection. It wasn't for me. Then I listened to another audiobook. It was Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde. This was okay for me, but I felt like it was somewhat ruined by already knowing the twist. I was on a bit of an audiobook kick this month, so the next thing that I finished listening to was A Wild Sheep Chase by Haruki Murakami. This is one of Murakami's earlier works, but I actually think it would be a really good place to start with his magical realism. To me, it felt a bit more cohesive than some of his later magical realism, and while I didn't enjoy it quite as much as Kafka on the Shore or The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, I thought that it was a very enjoyable audiobook. And then I read Hiromi Goto's Chorus of Mushrooms. I read this because Jason from The Heavy Blanks has said that it's one of his favourite books. I did really enjoy this. It's quite fragmented as a narrative, but I enjoyed getting into the heads of these characters. There were a few points where I found the fragmentation to be slightly distracting, but besides that, I thought this was a great read. Roxane Gay's An Untamed State has just been released in New Zealand, and I read a proof copy of this. This was a difficult read because it is very graphic in places, but it's a book that I couldn't put down. I literally read it in one sitting. I didn't need a bookmark. I just read it. It's not a short book, but I would warn you, if you start this book you won't be able to put it down because you have to find out what happens. It's about the kidnapping of a wealthy woman in Haiti whose father won't pay her ransom, and it outlines what happens to her during her imprisonment. A concern that I have, at least about the edition that was released in New Zealand, is that it has a John Green quote on the front. Now, this is definitely not a book that is written for John Green's audience. It is not a YA book, and I think that the John Green quote kind of suggests that. Usually you can go by the recommendations that are on the front of a book and discern from that what sort of book it will be. This is not a YA book. It is not for John Green's audience in general, and if books had ratings like films do, this would definitely be R18. So do proceed with caution. My next read was very light in comparison, was Egg and Spoon by Gregory Maguire. Now this book has a gorgeous cover and I really like the premise of it. It is a children's book, but we had a whole lot of copies of it at work, so I thought that I'd read it so that I can recommend it. And indeed I can. It's a very fun read. It has a case of mistaken identity at the beginning where an aristocratic girl and a peasant girl get swapped, and it's about the adventures that ensue. This is a great tale of magical realism. There's lots of Russian folklore in there, so if you're familiar with any of that, then this would be a really fun one to read. Then I listened to Ghost Written by David Mitchell. I didn't think that this was quite as developed as Cloud Atlas and the Bone Clocks, but it was very enjoyable. It's set in the same world as Cloud Atlas and the Bone Clocks, so it fills in some of those gaps. And I think the more of David Mitchell's works that you read, the bigger picture you get, and it makes them very satisfying reads. So I'm definitely keen to check out some of his other works that I haven't got to yet. I finally caved in and read Gone Girl. I was getting a bit annoyed with having to not watch certain videos because of spoilers for this, because people assume that everyone's read it by now. But I was on the whole pretty impressed by this. It was a good page turner. I read it in one day. I did have some issues with some of the gender stereotypes used, but I can't deny that it was an enjoyable read. Then I read my first Agatha Christie, which was Murder on the Orient Express. This was good, enjoyable. I read most of it in one sitting. Wasn't crazy about it. Crime isn't something that I usually read, but it was pretty enjoyable, and I guess this is a pretty good place to start with Agatha Christie. Then I finally finished reading Persuasion by Jane Austen, the 200-page book that took me longer to read than War and Peace. I was really expecting that this would be my favourite Austen yet, but I just didn't connect with it. I got about halfway through this and then switched to reading it on my phone, which I think was a good move because I enjoyed the second half much more than I enjoyed the first half, and I think the medium had a big part to play in that. The Oxford Wells classics are good in terms of their introductions and their explanatory notes, but this is just badly designed. For starters, the cover is not inspiring in the slightest, and the pages look like this, and I feel like if this had been typeset better, then I would have read it a lot quicker and I would have enjoyed it much more. So the next time I decide to read a Jane Austen, I will definitely look for a copy that is better typeset. The next audiobook was Brango Dreaming by Jekyll and Mr Hyde, and I thought this was absolutely superb. It's a memoir aimed at children, but it's definitely one that adults can enjoy as well. It's also written in verse, which meant that it worked very well in audio format. It's read by the author, which always adds something to it, I think, and I thought this was just wonderful. If you haven't read it already, then definitely recommend that you do. Then I got my hands on an advanced reader's copy of The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro. I have done a full spoiler-free review of this, and I will link that in the description. Needless to say, I absolutely loved this book. I thought it was wonderful. I can't wait for it to come out in March so I can pick up my own copy. We're nearly there, I promise. And then I read a third children's book, The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Ship of Her Own Making. This was a fun read, and I'm sure that you all know about this book by now. I picked this up because I noticed that not many people had bought it in the shop, and I'd heard so many good things about it on BookTube that I wanted to be able to recommend it personally, and I will definitely be doing so. I'm not crazy about reading children's literature as an adult, but this was delightful. I don't know that I'll be rushing to read the rest of the series, but it was a fun read. I'll just read you my favourite quote from this because I thought it was perfect. "A deaf little child? How sweet. We should adopt her and teach her to write symphonies." And the final book that I read in January was another one by Jen Campbell. It's More Weird Things Customers Say in Bookshops. Thank you, Jen Campbell, for bringing so much joy into my life, because this made me laugh so much. Working in a bookshop myself, I've had some similar things said to me, so this completely appeals to my sense of humour. It's just lovely and is just as good as the first one. So that was my very long-winded January wrap-up. I was going to talk about some of my current reads, but this video has gone on long enough. So as always, thank you very much for watching. I will hopefully see you next time. And goodbye.